Welcome to the Daily Dawg podcast. I'm Jordan. Today is Monday, April 27th. Today we're going to talk about Indiana football, Indiana winning the national championship. Now, the reason I bring this up is one thing that's really been a sticking point for me, or I've had a kind of a gripe with ever since Indiana won the national championship, is the notion of how great it is for college football. What a wonderful story it is that Indiana's won the national championship. In fact, it's the Hollywood story. Hollywood couldn't have written the story as good as this if they tried, people say. And I'm sorry, that's just not really the story here. Indiana is not the Little Sisters of the Poor. They're not an underfunded tiny team that's never been able to make it into the big leagues and play with the big boys. They're not a team like Florida State of the 90s that tried forever, 80s and 90s, that was always coming up wide left or wide right or just short against their rivals like Miami, that kept them from winning the national championship, but were always there and always close. Indiana is a team that is, in fact, truly, as people have said, they are one of the worst teams in college football as far as the power conference teams, the Division I teams of old, of teams of that type. There's other teams that have just made it up into the higher level of college football, but those teams have not been playing for as long, so their losing winning percentage isn't as relevant. The only other team that's consistently been a part of major college football, been a major conference that has a worse winning percentage, honestly, is Wake Forest, which has about a 422 winning percentage versus Indiana's 430 winning percentage. And again, Indiana was actually below Wake Forest, but 11-2 last year, or year before, and 16-0 last year, and suddenly they're not in the bottom of college football winning percentage anymore. So, but that doesn't mean, like I said, that they were this little school that could never get over the hump, or this team that just couldn't find the money and had all this bad luck and hardship come to them and they just couldn't figure out how to win, or that they had these fans that were desperate and they were always close but just missing out on the top player and just missing out on or their best player got injured and they missed out on the chance. That's not the story of this team. This is a team whose fans and administration have basically been apathetic to football for almost its entire existence, which is why they've been so poor. Indiana has had, just in my lifetime, I went back and looked, and they have had a string of unbelievably mediocre or unimpressive coaches. And when I say that, I'm just saying, look, start with Lee Corso. All of you who watch College Game Day are familiar with Lee Corso. Everybody on the set calls him Coach. He's finally retired after a long career. He's a very entertaining fellow, but he was not a particularly great coach. He was a coach at Indiana for 10 years, had a 378 winning percentage. He was there for 10 years and won less than 40% of his games. He was followed by Sam Weish, actually, who was the coach of the Cincinnati Bengals, got him a Super Bowl, but Sam Weish coached 1 year and went 3-8. And then they hired a fellow by the name of Bill Mallory. Bill Mallory had actually coached at Colorado for a while and had a modicum of success, but was not super successful. But Mallory coached maybe one of the most successful coaches at Indiana. He actually got him to 6 bowl games over a 13-year span of time and had a 466 winning percentage. Then they hired a person that I've never heard of before and never coached anywhere else as a head coach other than Indiana, in Cam Cameron, who coached for 5 seasons with a 321 winning percentage. Then they hired Jerry DiNardo, who had coached at Vanderbilt and LSU. SEC fans might remember. He had a losing record at Vanderbilt, which is not unusual. A lot of people did. He had a barely winning record at LSU, so they fired him because he was just okay and he was never going to take them to where they wanted to go. So he coached for 3 seasons at Indiana, compiling a 229 winning percentage. Then they hired a fellow by the name of Terry Hopner. If you never heard of him, neither have I. He coached 2 seasons at Indiana with a 391 winning percentage. Then they hired another fellow named Bill Lynch, 4 seasons, 388. You're getting the point, right? Kevin Wilson is the next guy, another guy who I don't think was ever coached anywhere outside of Indiana as a head coach, 357 winning percentage over 6 seasons. And then Tom Allen. You might remember Tom Allen was a recent coach. They had a modicum of success here or there. They had Michael Penix as the quarterback for a little bit before he went with Kalen DeBoer, who had been his offensive coordinator and ended up across the country when he got the job at Washington. And so that kind of ended Indiana's run at being a better better team when DeBoer and Penix left, but Tom Allen was able to hang on for 8 seasons with a .402 winning percentage. Indiana has a long history of mediocrity. They have a smallish, medium-sized stadium. They constantly hire coaches who have been possibly good at smaller schools, but generally nobody from a big school. They've never gone out and poached a guy like LSU did this year, desperate to get back on the winning track. What does LSU do? Go out, they go steal Lane Kiffin for all kinds of money from Ole Miss, and they throw $40 million into the portal era, in this new era of portal thing to bring in new players and just revamp this team. Indiana has never done that. They go out and they fire a coach that's been there too long. They probably didn't want to fire him and have to pay buyouts on the contract, so they let him play out the contracts. They have a long history of letting mediocre to poor coaches with poor track records coach for 5, 6, 7, 8 seasons before finally getting rid of them and then going to another small school and plucking a coach out. And what's a good thing about getting a coach from a small school? Well, they're not going to cost you very much money. Even when they're stepping up to the Big Ten to coach at Indiana, well, when you're coaching at Northern Illinois or someplace like that, you'll happily take the least amount of money that anybody would get for coaching a major college football team. And that's what Indiana's done. And Indiana's fans didn't care. They didn't demand anything different. They're not long suffering. I mean, they are long suffering in that their team hasn't been very good, but they've barely showed up. They regularly could barely get half or a quarter of the stadium full in a 50,000 seat stadium. They're in the heart of the country in Indiana. And yes, that's a big basketball territory, but it's also pro and college football have had large success in there. Look, Notre Dame is in the state of Indiana, one of the greatest football programs of all time. They attract talent and people, and fans care. And you look around, and attached and adjacent to Indiana, you have Chicago, the Chicago Bears, the Green Bay Packers in Wisconsin. There's great football in Ohio, pro football, Ohio State adjacent. The region can support great and winning football. Is it a hotbed of talent like Texas or Georgia or Florida or California? No. But again, Notre Dame has been able to go around the country and collect players wherever they needed to. Ohio State's been able to bring in players. You know, there are multiple teams in the region that have been better than Indiana and have worked harder. They've put more seats in the stands. They have built bigger stadiums. They put more money and more investment, and they went out and hired coaches. They brought in coaches that were successful at major programs and said, we want a taste of that. Indiana lets a coach for like 8 years doing a mediocre to poor job so they don't have to buy out his contract. Then they fire him and they go pluck another cheap coach from a small school. And that's exactly what they did this time too. In the same year that Curt Cignetti was hired to start for the 2024 season, Kalen DeBoer was hired at Alabama. Kalen DeBoer was the big hire of that year. Now, is it realistic to think that Indiana was going to go fight for Kalen DeBoer to steal him from Washington? No. But did they try? No. Did they go hire a big name coach from somewhere else? Did they say, we're invested and we're putting money in? Look, it can be done. And yes, programs have some success, like Virginia Tech was able to go get James Franklin after he was fired. Now, granted, he was fired from Penn State, but you know, James Franklin is a serious coach, and they put a big effort into that. I'm just saying, these are the kind of things, like Indiana could have made a move like that too. I mean, I guess you could say getting Jerry DiNardo, who had coached at Vanderbilt and LSU, was kind of a move in that direction, except for Jerry DiNardo had a losing record combined at those two schools. So it wasn't like people were desperate to get Jerry DiNardo in to coach their program. So my point is look, Indiana has and going back to sort of further my point, they're a part of the Big Ten. In the last few years, especially, Indiana in 2021, they ranked like 13th in terms of athletic department revenue. They are a staple in the top 25 of athletic department revenue, even before this surge in football, because they're a part of the Big Ten, and the Big Ten is handing out incredible money to their members. So Indiana has had the ability as part of the Big Ten. Indiana is a respected athletic program in other aspects, especially basketball, men's basketball. They know how to win. They know how to build a winner. They could have tried to win at college football, but they just didn't. Their fans didn't care. Administration didn't care. Administration didn't do anything different because fans didn't demand it. And they've just been very apathetic. And frankly, they got lucky on this. This was an accident. My point, going back to Kalen DeBoer, nobody, yes, it's talked about now. Curt Cignetti was on the Alabama staff in like 2009 to 2011, and he was the wide receivers coach, and he coached people like Amari Cooper and Julio Jones, and he had some good credentials there. However, leaving Alabama, he ends up coaching at small schools, like ends up at James Madison, and then from 2 years at James Madison up to Indiana. But this was not a name. This was not one of the named people on Nick Saban's staff that everybody was after. Everybody was like, oh, that Curt Cignetti guy, we got to get a hold of him. Now, I'm not trying to demean Curt Cignetti. Everybody missed on him, right? Look how good a job he did. Yes, he made James Madison relevant and a winner. And then he comes over to Indiana, and he brought a lot of the same players to Indiana, and they have just kicked butt physically and literally. Okay. They have been a great team and they played great football. He is obviously a great coach. And I have no problem with that being the story, with the story being, hey, take a look at Curt Cignetti and what he's done. But it's, yes, and he did it at Indiana, and Indiana is one of the worst programs of all time. But my point is really, Indiana is one of the worst programs of all time because they wanted to be, because they didn't try to be anything else. They haven't put any other effort into it. Their fans didn't want it. The administration didn't want it. They haven't spent the money on it. They haven't spent the effort. Look at South Carolina. South Carolina has an 86,000 seat stadium. They regularly sell out. They've never won anything. They've only had a few seasons when Spurrier came, honestly, where they won back-to-back double-digit wins. They have less than 5 or 6 or 8 seasons in their history of double-digit wins. They've won some bowl games here or there, but they've never won hardly any championships of any kind. They have rivals all over the place like Georgia and Clemson that are major programs that constantly beat them down and have won 3 out of 4 games every time they play. And yet 85,000 strong, pack in the stadiums. They dance to the song. They wave their white towels. They jump around and they go crazy because they care, and they pump money and effort and the facilities and the desperate desire and the ability. I mean, they brought Steve Spurrier in. That's an example I'm talking about. Steve Spurrier was not Jerry DiNardo. He's not some washed up coach who was only mediocre at a really good school like LSU. Steve Spurrier's a national championship coach from his alma mater at Florida and a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback before that. Steve Spurrier forgets more about football than most of us know about it. And South Carolina was able to make a bold move and bring him in. Did they win a national championship, an SEC championship? No, but they had the best moment that South Carolina football has ever had. It didn't last. Spurrier eventually retired. They're still trying to find their way back to that peak. But that's what I'm talking about. That's the kind of commitment and concern and investment when a small school who just wants it, who just desperately desires it and puts everything they can into it, goes for it. And Indiana is not that school. So they're not the little engine that finally made it up the hill. They're not the sad little, they're not even Boise State. We watched Boise State rise up from nothing in the strange blue turf and a weird, out in the middle of the, far western part of the country where nobody even knows where they were from or what they're doing. And we watched them rise up to come and win a Fiesta Bowl against Oklahoma, and a star running back proposed to the cheerleader on the sideline, and we all cheered, and it was wonderful. And again, I can appreciate that. I love that story because they worked for it. They built it. They tried hard. They built it up, and they got into they were the little guy, and they got into the big game, and then they made good on it. It was a great story. That was a Hollywood ending. Indiana is not a better story than that. It's not even close to the equal story of that. Curt Cignetti, amazing story. Guy that nobody looked at, nobody cared about, gets into his 60s before he gets a Power 5 conference head coaching job. And in his first 2 years, he goes, 11 and 16, so 27 and 2, and wins a national championship. And yes, wins a national championship at a place where nobody ever thought you would. That's amazing, And so, that is a big story. And then what else is the story of Indiana? Well, I guess the one thing that maybe a lot of people get enthused about is that Indiana tells us a story that right now anybody can win, right? So, and I say anybody, again, is Boise State going to win a national championship? No, they don't have Big Ten money or SEC money. They can't throw $40 million like LSU at a new roster and $20 million or whatever it is in Lane Kiffin's getting a season and pluck a coach like Lane Kiffin out of that. So that kind of thing. Now, that doesn't mean LSU's going to win. I mean, we're all going to kind of root against Lane, right? We're all going to laugh if LSU, goes 8-4 or 9-3 again and fails to even make, the SEC championship game. We're all going to root against them because, yes, we hate it when the big money people throw their money and their influence around, and it's not cheating. You're allowed to give the guy more money, but it just, something feels wrong, right? Like here, Lane Kiffin's doing a great job, and I like the story of Lane Kiffin making Ole Miss relevant. I don't like the story of LSU plucking Lane Kiffin away, paying him a ton of money, and then buying a huge roster. So look, Indiana, even in this NIL Porta era, I mean, they did get Fernando Mendoza, and that was a great pickup. And yes, Georgia looked at him too, and we talked to him, and apparently the big hang-up might have been that he was going to have to compete for the job. And I'm not trying to knock him. Seems like a great kid, and he's done a great job. So I'm not knocking that saying, oh, he didn't want to compete. I would go look, if I'm going to transfer schools and make a big move, I'll go somewhere where I know I'm going to have basically the starting position. I'm not going to have to fight with another guy and make the big move and then find out I'm not the starter. He was the starter at Cal, so why would he want to leave and then find out he's not the starter somewhere else? So I'm not knocking that, but I'm just saying it all kind of worked together where Indiana was able, I don't know what kind of money, I guess, that they're throwing into NIL, but nobody has talked about Indiana as throwing the biggest money in NIL. And nobody would have thought necessarily that bringing all these players over from James Madison would make the difference, right? And so obviously Curt Cignetti is a wonderful coach both he's obviously coaches the team really well. They play hard, they play discipline, they do all the right things. They have good schemes and good strategy. And then on top of that, he's obviously evaluating players in a way that other people aren't. He's able to see guys who are been overlooked by other people and then bring them in and have them have huge success. Even Fernando Mendoza, what I was trying to say is he was the top portal quarterback, but I don't think everybody was sitting back at this time last year saying, well, wherever Fernando Mendoza goes, that's the team that's going to be in the lead to win the national championship. That's not how that move was perceived. It seems like it now that he's just drafted number 1 overall, won the national championship. He's got the body, he's got the arm, he's got the brains, he's got it all, it seems like. But, go back and look at his numbers at Cal. He was growing into the job. So that's one of the things I don't love about this era of college football is I like the old era where you had to build a team and where guys had to grow with their team into being ready to take that next step. I'd have been more excited if Fernando Mendoza stayed at Cal. They had a new coach or something and whatever it took, and he rose up from first year. He was pretty good at Cal. Next year, a little better, showing growing production. Then he stays at Cal, takes that next step, puts up Heisman numbers and leads Cal to the national championship game, whatever. That's a great story, right? But he puts in a couple good years at Cal. They are helping build him and watching him grow. And then right when he's finally matured, he's got all the pieces together to be a difference maker quarterback. Then he just goes to a different school and, where they're just a quarterback short of being back in the playoff, and boom, he wins a championship. That story doesn't compel me. That doesn't seem exciting. I mean, again, you can look at it and say, isn't it great that you can take a team that was, what was Indiana? I don't know what they were before Cignetti came in, but they were bad enough that their coach got fired. I think they were 3-8. So he takes that team, he completely changes the roster. They go 11-2. Then they add a couple more pieces, keep a lot of the same guys together, but big a piece being Mendoza. And then they go 16-0, and they're the best team in college football. I guess that's a great story, but I'm kind of more of a fan of watching coaches and teams build over time to put together the pieces, have a plan that's executing, not just we'll grab this coach and these guys and this thing and we'll all end up at Indiana or this school or that school for 1 or 2 years and boom, we win a title. And then, honestly, it's one of the things I've never loved about some of the way pro sports plays out. The teams make a run, then they can't afford to keep the pieces, or the guys move on, it falls apart, then the next thing. I don't think it's a great story. I think it's certainly, I guess the best thing you can say about the Indiana story is it should invigorate people to have hope, in the sense of saying, hey, and it should push fans to push their school to say, hey, you get the right coach and the right players in here. I don't care what we were last year. We could be a playoff team or maybe even win the national championship in a year or two. That should give a lot of people hope. But in reality, again, he didn't go to Boydman. It wasn't Signetti. Signetti did not get Mendoza to come to James Madison, and James Madison didn't win the national championship. So it wasn't the little school jumping over all the big hoops. It wasn't the team, with the $1 million budget against the team with the $200 million budget winning out. This was Indiana with a $170 million athletic budget, finally and accidentally having hired yet again the same kind of coach they always did, a somewhat obscure budget move that nobody else was looking for at that time. I'm not saying that's who Curt Signetti is. He was misidentified. Don't. I'll say what a pastor that I get to hear a lot, and I appreciate. He says, church, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Curt Signetti. In fact, I'm in awe of Curt Signetti. Okay, he's done an amazing job, but there's little doubt in starting the 2024 season when Indiana hired him, he was a budget move for a big school. He wasn't the big name guy. He wasn't chasing down the Kalen DeBoers or the Lane Kiffins or somebody who'd put a proven track record at a big school and saying, we desperately want that and we'll pay to get it. He was a guy they could afford on the budget that they're used to spending, but they had money. They could have done something more. They could have been more desperate to win. They weren't trying. They just ended up with Curt Signetti and a bunch of guys from James Madison that formed a core. You put Mendoza on there, the fire was lit, and now all of a sudden they're a national championship team. And frankly, from the administration's point of view, it's an accident. Not a great story, not the amazing run, not a team that built from the ground up, from the ashes, nothing like that. And if you're inspired by the fact that a team that's never won before can win out of nowhere if you get the right coach and you buy in the right players, I guess then you can be inspired by that. But the reality is that Indiana still isn't the story about the Boise States or the, I'm trying to think of who else, but those kind of teams rising up to win the national championship. That's not the story here. Even BYU. BYU made the playoff. Well, I guess they didn't make the playoff. They were in their conference championship game and they got bounced by Texas Tech. But they, what I'm getting at is they were the team. What am I trying to say? I'm sorry. I sort of fumbled my way into that, but no, I went back because I got confused. Did BYU make the playoff? I remember watching BYU. They did not. They got bounced in their conference championship game by Texas Tech. Anyway, BYU even is what I was trying to say would be a great story because BYU is still a smaller revenue school, independent, fighting their way through. They've been able to win on a high level, maintain and keep a coach who's done a great job, get some compelling players in there that have had some national relevance and make a name. And if they were able to take that next step and make the playoff, make a run, get to the championship game, or even win the national championship, much like they did back in 1984, that would be an exciting and compelling story. That would be a little guy taking the step. Indiana is not. Indiana is just a team that could have done it many years ago, just never bothered to try, never bothered to care, and they weren't even really doing it this time. I'm telling you, it was a total accident when they hired Curt Signetti that he turned out to be the guy who took them to a championship. And so I don't think it's the great story. I don't think it's the Hollywood ending. I don't think it's the amazing story that Hollywood couldn't have written this story. Hollywood could have easily written this story. This is actually just like a slick, big budget Hollywood action movie with no heart and no meaning that just is guaranteed to put people in seats. That's kind of what it is in the sense of, Big Ten team hires the right coach, not really trying. He brings in the right players. They win. Yay. So that's my take on it. It's been bothering me since the end of the college football season. We can talk more again about how good Cignetti is, about how Indiana did it. What was it? Was it the coaching? Was it the players? Was it all the above? Break down their statistics, which are really actually astounding. I mean, they were in the top 10, it seems like, in just about every important statistical category all season long. And like I said, yes, they didn't play the greatest schedule, but in the end, by the time they finished the season, they played a good enough schedule to judge it by. And you can't knock that. So there's a lot to talk about there. There's a lot to talk about Georgia football. We'll get back to that too. We had a spring game last week. Georgia won. There was some good things to talk about, some things that may be a little disappointing. Had a major injury, one of our portal signings. How's that going to affect things going forward? It's a little early to get too predictive, but there's always room to talk about Georgia football. Also, can't take a moment without saying, hey, go Braves. Braves are 20-9, first team to win 20 games in the majors this season, leading the division by 6.5 games, which nobody saw coming just from all the injuries and downturn the Braves had recently. And on top of that, they're the only team in baseball to have not lost a series yet. They've won 8 series and tied 1, split a 4-game series with Arizona. So yes, that means I will be talking about Braves baseball this summer. This is the Daily Dawg. The Daily Dawg is concerned about all things sports, specifically things that many Dawg fans, well, let's put it this way. I think a lot of Dawg fans, and I'm happy for non-Dawg fans to become a part of this too. I am a Dawg fan, and so I'm going to come at it from a Southern Dawg fan perspective, a Braves fan perspective, and but like talking about today, like Indiana, we're going to look at the whole picture, and we're going to talk about what's important. So hope you enjoyed this. Please share it with folks if you have. Hope you have a great day, and we'll be back again tomorrow with more commentary. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Have a great day. And most importantly, for all you Dawg fans out there, go Dogs.